Welcome to Dark Domain, where the unknown lurks in every shadow. Here we dive deep into the stories that twist reality and blur the lines between what is real and what should never be. Tonight, prepare yourself for 3 tales that will make you question what's waiting just beyond the edge of your understanding. Before we begin, think about this. Where's one place you'd never want to be alone? Let me know in the comments below. And as you listen, see if tonight's stories change your answer. The Beacons of Endless Dark. I've worked as a Coast Guard officer for 12 years now, and in that time I've seen things that would unsettle even the most hardened sailors. Wrecked ships, bodies claimed by the sea, mysterious flares in the night sky. But nothing could have prepared me for the night the lighthouses started appearing. It was a Thursday late into October when we first noticed something odd off the coast. I was on the night shift at Station 29, a small, isolated outpost that overlooks a stretch of the North Atlantic. Our radar picked up something strange, lights blinking on and off right on the horizon. At first, we thought it was just a cargo ship. They're common in that area, moving silently across the water with their safety lights blinking. But these lights were different. There were 3 of them, positioned in a perfect triangle, and they weren't moving. They stayed completely still, pulsing softly in the darkness. Our first instinct was to call it in. We tried contacting the nearest maritime authorities, but our radio equipment was acting up, static and interference, which wasn't unusual during the colder months. I radioed our base anyway, but there was no response. Probably just a ship, my partner Greg said, glancing out at the distant lights. They'll move eventually. Maybe they're anchored. But the hours dragged on, and the lights didn't move. They didn't even flicker, just blinked, steady as a heartbeat. By midnight, I was restless. The fog had started to roll in, thick and heavy, obscuring the ocean's surface. But even through the dense fog, the lights remained, brighter now, as though they were pushing through the mist itself. "We should go check it out," I finally said, the unease gnawing at me. Greg raised an eyebrow. "You want to take the boat out into that?" He gestured to the fog, which was growing thicker by the minute. "It'll be a fool's errand. We won't see a damn thing." But something about those lights unsettled me, like they didn't belong there. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. I insisted, and after some grumbling, Greg agreed. We grabbed our gear, and within minutes we were on the water, the small patrol boat cutting through the waves. The fog enveloped us almost immediately, turning everything into a blank canvas of gray. It was disorienting, even for seasoned sailors like us. The only thing guiding us were the distant lights, still pulsing faintly in the mist. "Could be a rogue buoy," Greg muttered, though he didn't sound convinced. "No buoy lights like that," I said, shaking my head. As we drew closer, the fog thinned just enough to reveal the source of the lights. What I saw sent a chill through my bones. There, rising from the water, were 3 lighthouses, massive structures towering far higher than any lighthouse should, with weathered stone and rusted metal railings. They were old, ancient even, yet their lights were impossibly bright, piercing through the fog with mechanical precision. Each lighthouse was identical, standing in a perfect triangle formation, as if guarding something in the center. "Lighthouses?" Greg whispered, his voice tinged with disbelief. "There's no record of any lighthouses out here. None. Not in any of the charts." I scanned my memory too. He was right. This stretch of coastline had no structures, no islands, no rocks that would warrant them. Yet here they were, towering over the sea, ominous and silent. As we drew closer, the boat's engine sputtered, then died completely. Greg and I exchanged uneasy glances. It wasn't the first time equipment had failed in the fog, but this felt different. The air was heavy, almost oppressive. My skin prickled like we were being watched. We drifted, the current carrying us slowly toward the nearest lighthouse. The closer we got, the more I could see the details of the stonework. Intricate carvings etched into the walls, almost like runes, though I couldn't decipher them. They looked ancient, older than any lighthouse I'd ever seen. The light from the beacon overhead spun slowly, rhythmically, bathing the fog in waves of light and shadow. Suddenly, something in the water caught my eye. A ripple, a flash of movement beneath the surface. Greg saw it too. What the hell is that? The water, once calm, began to stir. The ripples grew larger, more violent, as if something huge was moving beneath us. My heart raced and I grabbed the boat's oar, preparing for whatever might happen next. But then, as quickly as the water had stirred, it stilled again. Silence. No waves. No sound. Just the eerie, constant turning of the lighthouse beacons. "We need to get out of here," Greg said, his voice tight with fear. "Now." I nodded, my hands shaking as I tried to restart the engine. Nothing. The boat stayed still, bobbing in the water like a toy in a bathtub. Then, without warning, a low hum filled the air. It wasn't coming from the boat, it was coming from the lighthouses. A deep, vibrating sound, like the drone of an enormous machine powering up. I looked up and that's when I saw it. In the space between the lighthouses, where the ocean should have stretched endlessly, the water had begun to sink. Slowly, the sea itself was receding, pulling downward as though it were being drained. In its place was an opening, a black yawning void in the water growing larger by the second. "What is that?" Greg whispered, his eyes wide with terror. Before I could respond, the hum intensified. The lighthouse's lights began to flicker, then strobe, faster and faster. The water continued to fall away, revealing a cavernous space beneath the ocean. The sight of it was impossible. There was no bottom, just darkness. A pit, stretching deep into the earth, swallowing everything. I tried the radio again, my hands shaking. "Mayday, mayday. This is Station 29. We need immediate..." Static. Just static. Greg was backing away from the edge of the boat, his face pale. "We need to jump," he said, his voice trembling. "We need to get out of the water before..." But it was too late. From the depths of the black pit, something began to rise. At first, it was just a shape, vague, indistinct. But as it emerged from the darkness, I realized with growing horror that it wasn't a single thing, but many. A mass of writhing, pale limbs, intertwined and moving as one. Dozens, no, hundreds of figures, rising from the pit, their bodies slick with water, their faces blank and featureless. They crawled, impossibly tall and thin, their elongated arms reaching toward the boat. The humming grew louder, more deafening, as the figures pulled themselves free of the blackness. I could see them now, clearly, twisted human-like forms, yet utterly alien, their limbs too long, their movements too smooth, their heads turned in unison, as if they could sense us, though they had no eyes. Greg was screaming now, but I couldn't hear him over the hum. One of the figures reached the boat, its hand, if you could call it that, stretching out and brushing the side of the hull. I yanked the oar, trying to push it away, but its grip was cold, wet, and unyielding. The others were following, more of them crawling from the pit, their limbs slipping and sliding over each other. They moved as one, a mass of bodies climbing toward the light of the lighthouses. And then they stopped. The humming ceased. The figures, inches from the boat, froze in place, their heads tilted as if listening. The lights from the lighthouses blinked off. Total darkness. For a moment, the world was silent. Then, in the distance, a new light appeared. Not from the lighthouses, but from beneath the water, deep within the pit. A soft, glowing blue, like the light of some forgotten star. The figures turned, drawn to the light. They began to move again, not toward us, but back into the pit, retreating into the blackness from which they had come. Slowly they disappeared, one by one, until only the glow remained. And then, without warning, the lighthouses blinked back on, their beacons sweeping over the ocean, as if nothing had happened. The water returned to normal, the void in the ocean sealing itself as if it had never been there. Greg and I sat in stunned silence, the boat rocking gently beneath us. I don't know how long we sat there watching the lighthouses pulse rhythmically like they always had. But I knew one thing for certain. Those lighthouses were not meant to guide ships. They were meant to guard something else. The frequencies we cannot hear. The nights are the quietest. Working late in the studio after everyone's gone, there's nothing but the soft hum of machinery and the occasional creak of the old building to keep me company. I always enjoyed this part, the solitude of it. Sound engineers like me thrive in the silence, where every subtle noise becomes a universe unto itself. But there was something different about this night. Something I couldn't quite place at first. It started with a recording I didn't recognize, sitting in the inbox of my work email. I don't usually open unsolicited files, common practice, but the subject line caught my eye. You won't hear it. Curiosity got the better of me. I downloaded the file and loaded it into the sound software. It was just over 2 minutes long, but the waveform was odd. Most sounds create spikes and valleys, chaotic, but with patterns. Human voices, instruments, ambient noise. But this was smooth, eerily smooth, as if someone had recorded pure silence. I hit play. At first, nothing. Just the same hum of the studio around me. I watched the playhead move across the track, waiting for something, anything. Then, about 30 seconds in, I felt it. A pressure in my skull, like my head was slowly being squeezed in a vice. It wasn't a sound in the traditional sense, nothing I could pinpoint with my ears, but I could feel it deep in my bones. I stopped the track, my hand trembling. The pressure disappeared instantly. My first thought was that it might be a high-pitched frequency, something outside the range of normal hearing. I adjusted the levels, boosting the higher frequencies, and hit play again. This time, the sensation came quicker. 30 seconds in, and there it was, an almost imperceptible tone, just above the range of what I could consciously process. It wasn't the kind of tone that would make your ears ring, but it made my teeth itch, set my nerves on edge. My vision blurred for a moment as though my brain was struggling to make sense of something it couldn't comprehend. I paused the recording. The sensation faded, leaving me in the familiar hum of the studio. What the hell was this? I pulled up the metadata on the file, but there was nothing. No name, no timestamp, no origin. Just a file called track1.wave. It didn't even have a sender. The email was blank, no address, no signature. I tried replaying it several times, each time stopping when the pressure became too much. It felt like standing too close to an invisible wall that was gradually closing in on me. I stepped away from the desk, shaking my head. This wasn't possible. It had to be a prank, some elaborate hoax. But then the hallucinations started. The first one was subtle. As I was packing up to leave, I caught something in the corner of my eye. A figure, standing in the shadowed corner of the room. My heart jumped, and I spun around, but nothing was there. Just the empty space where the sound booth stood. I laughed it off, chalking it up to fatigue. It was late, after all, and I'd been staring at screens for hours. But the feeling of being watched lingered as I made my way out of the building. Every shadow seemed to stretch and twist in unnatural ways, and the further I got from the studio, the more my chest tightened with an inexplicable sense of dread. The next day, I couldn't get the sound out of my head. It wasn't a melody or a hum, but more like a presence. It gnawed at me, pulling my thoughts back to the recording. Against my better judgment, I returned to the studio that night and loaded the file again. This time I had an idea. I hooked up an oscilloscope to the sound system, hoping to visually interpret whatever frequency was buried in the track. The results made no sense. The frequency registered far below anything that should have been audible to the human ear, somewhere around 19 Hz infrasound. That's when it hit me. Infrasound is known to cause feelings of unease, even hallucinations in some cases. But this was different. It wasn't just discomfort. It felt like something was trying to push through the barrier of reality itself, like the sound was a key trying to unlock some door in my mind. I sat there for hours replaying the track in different variations, tweaking the levels, amplifying the tone. And then, at exactly 2 minutes and 15 seconds into the track, something happened that made my blood run cold. The waveform changed. It spiked sharply, and a low voice, raspy and garbled, whispered, "Can you hear us now?" I froze. My heart hammered against my ribs. The voice wasn't from the recording. It was coming from behind me. I turned slowly, half expecting to see someone standing there, but the room was empty. Yet the air was heavy, thick with a presence I couldn't explain. It was as though the very fabric of the room had shifted, subtly, just beyond the edge of perception. I slammed the laptop shut and bolted from the studio, my skin crawling with the sensation that I was no longer alone. Over the next few days, I became obsessed. I scoured the internet for anything remotely similar, any mention of anomalous sounds or untraceable recordings. Most of what I found was pseudoscience, conspiracy theories about government experiments with infrasound or lost radio signals. None of it seemed credible, but it was all I had. The hallucinations grew worse. I started seeing things in the periphery, shapes, shadows, things that vanished the moment I turned to look at them, but they felt real. And that's what terrified me the most. The line between reality and whatever this was blurred more and more each day. I didn't know how to make it stop. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the tone. That deep, low hum reverberated through my skull like a tuning fork being struck over and over again. It wasn't just a sound, it was a force, a pressure pushing, always pushing. I decided to confront it, to let the recording play all the way through. Maybe it would give me some kind of answer, or at least some closure. Maybe it would stop. I returned to the studio, now a place of dread rather than comfort. The building was quiet as usual. I sat down, plugged in my headphones, and took a deep breath. I opened the file. The pressure came instantly this time. My teeth ground together as I let the sound wash over me. The room seemed to pulse in time with the frequency. 30 seconds in, the first hallucination hit. A figure standing in the corner, shrouded in darkness, watching. But I didn't turn. I kept my eyes on the screen. At 1 minute, the walls started to breathe. They flexed and expanded like the lungs of some massive creature. I could feel its breath, hot and fetid, on the back of my neck. 2 minutes. My vision blurred, and the world seemed to tilt on its axis. The figure moved closer, but I still didn't look. My heart pounded, each beat syncing with the rhythmic pulse of the tone. Then, at 2 minutes and 15 seconds, the voice returned. This time it was clearer. "You're almost there." My fingers hovered over the stop button. Every instinct screamed for me to shut it off. But I couldn't. I had to know. What was this sound? What was trying to get through? The tone intensified, rising in pitch and pressure until it felt like my skull would split open. And then, without warning, it stopped. Silence. A silence so deep it swallowed everything. I ripped off the headphones, gasping for breath, but the silence remained. It wasn't just an absence of sound, it was an absence of everything. The world itself felt muted, like I'd been cut off from reality. And that's when I saw it. The figure wasn't a hallucination anymore. It was standing right in front of me. Its face, or what should have been a face, was a blur of shifting, distorted features. Its form flickered like a bad signal, stuttering in and out of existence. It leaned in close, whispering words I couldn't understand, a language not meant for human ears. Then, with a jolt, the silence broke. The building creaked, the hum of machinery returned, and the figure was gone. I don't know what I unleashed that night. But I do know one thing. The sound wasn't just a recording. It was a door. And I opened it. The stain. It was just a stain. That's what I told myself the first time I noticed it on my ceiling. A faint, dark mark, roughly the size of a hand, nestled in the corner of the room where the light didn't quite reach, the kind of stain you wouldn't even notice unless you were looking for it. Maybe it had always been there, a harmless blotch from a long-forgotten water leak, or a shadow cast by the angle of the light. I never thought much about it, not at first, but soon it became impossible to ignore. I had just moved into the apartment a month ago, a quiet one-bedroom in a crumbling building on the outskirts of the city. It wasn't much, but the rent was cheap, and I needed a place to start over after everything fell apart back home. I thought the isolation might be good for me. The first night I noticed the stain, I had been tossing and turning in bed. Sleeplessness had become a regular companion ever since I moved in. The neighborhood was quiet enough, but there was something off about the silence. It wasn't peaceful, it felt thick, oppressive, like the silence was sitting on my chest, suffocating me. That night, as I stared up at the ceiling, I noticed the stain for the first time. A small, dark spot in the corner. It was strange. I could have sworn it hadn't been there before. I sat up staring at it for a long time, trying to figure out where it came from. But eventually, exhaustion took over, and I fell into a fitful sleep. When I woke up the next morning, the stain was bigger. Not by much, just a few inches wider, but I could tell it had grown. Now, instead of a vague smudge, it looked more defined, almost like it was spreading. I told myself it must have been my imagination, that I hadn't really been paying attention the night before. Maybe I just hadn't noticed how large it was to begin with. But even as I told myself that, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling gnawing at the back of my mind. Days passed, and the stain continued to grow. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Old buildings like this had leaky pipes, and water damage was inevitable. It was probably just a mold spot that no one had bothered to fix. But as the days stretched into weeks, the stain spread faster. What had started as a small dark patch now stretched across the ceiling above my bed, a web of black tendrils that seemed to be creeping down toward me, slow but deliberate. I contacted the landlord, of course, left voicemails, sent emails, no response. When I finally went to the office in person, the door was locked, and a handwritten sign on the window read, "Closed for renovations." I asked the neighbors, but most of them avoided my gaze when I brought up the building's maintenance. A few told me they hadn't seen the landlord in weeks. Some had never seen him at all. "He's probably out of town," one neighbor shrugged. "That's what he does. He just disappears for a while and comes back whenever he feels like it." The stain continued to grow. I tried everything to remove it, scrubbing it with bleach, painting over it, even scraping the ceiling with a knife. Nothing worked. No matter what I did, the stain remained, dark and slick, like it had been burned into the very structure of the building. And the worst part? It was starting to look like something. At night, when I stared at it for too long, the edges of the stain seemed to shift, as if it was moving ever so slightly, like the ripples of oil on water. It looked like fingers. Long, bony fingers stretching out from the corners of the room, reaching down toward me while I slept. I tried telling myself it was just a trick of the light, a result of my growing paranoia and sleep deprivation. But every morning the stain was a little bigger, a little darker, a little closer. I began to feel like I wasn't alone in my apartment. The air felt different, thicker somehow, charged with a static energy that raised the hairs on the back of my neck. I'd catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, shadows shifting in places where there shouldn't be any. And that smell, the sour, metallic stench of damp rot that seemed to cling to everything, no matter how much I cleaned. It got worse at night. Every time I turned off the lights, I could feel it, watching. The stain wasn't just a stain anymore. It was something more. I could sense its presence, lurking just above me, waiting for the moment when I would finally succumb to sleep. My dreams became a twisted reflection of my waking fears. In them, I was trapped in the apartment, unable to leave, while the stain grew and grew, its black tendrils creeping down the walls, curling around my limbs, dragging me toward it. I started sleeping with the lights on. One night around 2 a.m., I woke to the sound of scratching. At first I thought it was coming from the walls, rats maybe, or something in the pipes. But as I listened, I realized the sound wasn't coming from inside the walls. It was coming from the ceiling, from the stain. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was filled with that thick, oppressive silence again, but the scratching continued, faint but unmistakable. It was coming from directly above me, from the center of the stain. I stared at it, frozen, watching as the dark shape shifted, writhing like something alive. And then I saw it. The center of the stain bulged, the surface bubbling like tar, and something pushed through. Just for a moment I saw it. A finger, thin, black, and impossibly long, reaching out from the stain like a spider's leg, curling and uncurling in the air before retreating back into the ceiling. I screamed and bolted out of bed, my mind racing. What was that? Was I losing my mind? Had I really just seen a hand emerge from my ceiling? I spent the rest of the night in my bathroom, the only room without a direct line of sight to the stain. I locked the door and sat on the cold tile floor, trying to convince myself that I was hallucinating, that it was all in my head. But deep down I knew it wasn't. The next morning I noticed something even more disturbing. The stain had stopped growing. Instead, it had started to drip. Dark, oily droplets were falling from the edges of the stain, hitting the floor with a soft, rhythmic tap. The liquid was thick, black, and smelled like something rotting deep beneath the earth. I grabbed a bucket, trying to catch the drops before they soaked into the floor, but no matter how much I cleaned, the dripping wouldn't stop. It just kept coming, like the ceiling itself was bleeding. I couldn't stay there anymore, I knew that. But where could I go? The landlord wasn't responding. My friends had stopped taking my calls. They thought I was paranoid, losing it. And maybe I was. But I couldn't deny what I had seen. The stain was alive, and whatever it was, it wanted something from me. That night, I made the mistake of staying. I told myself I'd leave in the morning, pack up whatever I could and find another place, anywhere but there. But that night, as I lay awake in bed, I felt the room change. The air grew colder, the silence thickened, and then I heard it again, the scratching. This time, it wasn't faint. It was loud, insistent, like nails being dragged across wood. I sat up, heart hammering, and looked toward the stain. It was moving. The black shape writhed and twisted, the edges pulsating like a living organism. And then, without warning, the ceiling cracked. A jagged line split the plaster, right down the center of the stain. From the crack, that same oily black liquid began to pour out, faster this time, like a flood. It splattered onto the floor, thick and foul-smelling, soaking everything in its path. But that wasn't the worst part. From the crack, something began to emerge. First, a hand, long skeletal fingers covered in the same black sludge, clawing at the air. Then an arm, followed by another. Slowly, impossibly, a figure pulled itself out of the ceiling. It was humanoid, but twisted, grotesque, its body covered in that dark, dripping substance. Its limbs were too long, its head too large, and its eyes, empty, hollow pits that seemed to absorb the light. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I just watched in paralyzed horror as the thing crawled out of the stain, its body contorting in unnatural ways. It dropped to the floor with a wet, slapping sound, its limbs splayed out at odd angles. For a moment, it just lay there, twitching as if it was adjusting to the world outside the stain. Then, slowly, it lifted its head. Those empty eyes locked onto mine, and it smiled. A wide, unnatural grin that stretched far too wide across its face. Its teeth, jagged, sharp, like broken glass, glistened in the dim light. It began to crawl toward me, its limbs bending and snapping as it moved, dragging itself across the floor, leaving a trail of black sludge in its wake. I stumbled out of bed, my mind screaming at me to run, but my legs felt like lead. The thing was getting closer, its grin widening, its fingers reaching out, stretching toward me. I backed into the corner of the room, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might explode. Just as the thing was about to reach me, I snapped out of my paralysis and bolted for the door. I didn't stop to grab anything. I just ran. Out of the apartment, down the stairs, and into the cold night air. I didn't stop running until I was halfway across the city. I never went back to that apartment. I don't know what it was or why it chose me. All I know is that the stain wasn't just a stain. It was a doorway, a crack between worlds, and something else was living on the other side. Sometimes late at night I can still hear the sound of dripping, faint but unmistakable, like a steady tap of liquid hitting the floor. And when I close my eyes, I can see that smile. That terrible, twisted smile. I've learned to live with it. But every time I see a stain on the ceiling, no matter how small, I feel that same creeping dread. Because I know it's waiting. You've been listening to Dark Domain, where reality unravels and fear takes shape. If tonight's story left you questioning what's real, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss what's lurking in the shadows. Until next time, remember, the darkness is always watching.